Hi, this is Jeffrey Adorador, licensed marriage and family therapist. Welcome to another episode of Merely Human, mental, emotional, and relational health. It's kind of a rainy day in Northern California. I'm in my home studio in my living room, and I've got the fire going, and it's just one of those kind of cozy days. What a great opportunity to reach out and record this episode, choosing the right therapist. That's the topic I'd like to discuss today. Ultimately, what I want you to walk away from this episode is having greater clarity on the process of discernment that I suggest when embarking on therapy. What makes the right therapist for you? What are the key points to that? So we'll dive right in. Recently I was at a family gathering and an acquaintance sat down next to me. We began talking and she had this look on her face that was kind of perplexed. She said, "I've started therapy." And then she asked me point blank, "Are you supposed to really feel like you got something out of therapy?" To which I replied, "Absolutely." Although I could not give her my card because that would be a conflict of interest, I was happy to give her some advice. So that was the conversation that sparked this episode. So let's dive in. Once you've decided on pursuing therapy, I honestly want to congratulate you because your numbers are far and few between compared to the masses. Surprisingly, many people just ignore obvious signs of problems. They make up excuses. They don't want to look at their relationships. They don't want to look at themselves. The metaphor I think of is, can you imagine driving and you suddenly heard your car making unusual sounds? It started shaking a bit, but you just keep driving. You tell yourself, oh, it's no big deal. It'll work itself out. People come up with the craziest excuses. The most common is, I don't have time, or I don't have money. I sometimes say when it comes to relationship struggles, well, divorce is more expensive when it comes to money. People spend money on what they really, really want. And that's most often distractions and entertainment. That's a whole other episode with regard to addictions. But could you imagine the same kind of thing where you're just going along your business, everyday life, and your heart starts doing bizarre things? It maybe beats on regular, and there's a little pain in your chest, and you say to yourself, no big deal. I'll just make a hair appointment. Or maybe I'll just keep playing video games. It'll work itself out. Why would your need to take appropriate actions in these situations be dissimilar from making wise choices regarding your mental, emotional, or relational health? It's common sense to ask for help when you need it. You don't really learn mental, emotional, or relational health from school or, our family. We don't have the most stellar models out there. So it shows intelligence to hire a therapist. I want to help you find the right one, and that's what this episode's all about. Choosing the right therapist is critical to finding success in the counseling process. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with clients, and one of the first things I ask them upon introduction is, what's your experience with counseling? And so many of them have said, yes, I tried therapy recently or years ago, and I discontinued because it just wasn't a good match. A very common one is, they took sides. The therapist took sides in the context of a relational meeting, And so I hear tons of these stories. I hear stories about going to counseling in an institutional kind of environment, like a major hospital or major carrier. I won't name names, but they come to me and they say, yeah, this is a huge, reputable, institution, but the counseling is horrible because it's just like you're on the mill, the mill line of just like conveyor belts of counseling. So choosing a good one is critical. The first thing you want to consider within yourself is to do a self-assessment and the level of acuity needed. Okay, that big fancy word basically means the need. How critical is the need? The second is to consider the therapist's expertise and theoretical orientation. And lastly, but definitely not least important, is the therapist's personality. Because let's face it, you have to like the person enough to keep going. So let's chunk these down, these three factors, one by one. Mental health acuity, let's get back into that. It's the way to measure how severe and urgent a person's mental health conditions are. It's a spectrum that ranges from low acuity to high acuity. In other words, how intense are your symptoms? How badly do you need help? Low acuity issues are conditions that are not always diagnosable, like mild anxiety or stress. There's a myriad of examples. They require less intensive care or services and often require less therapy or intervention. Examples of low acuity cases include feeling down, depressed, anxious, feeling low motivation or lack of clarity or purpose in your life or your relationships. High acuity, on the other hand, are more severe and potentially dangerous conditions that require comprehensive and critical care. Examples of this include suicidal thoughts or ideations, or potential dangerous behavior between you and your loved one or family or relationships. These higher acuity cases may require closer monitoring, more frequent interventions, and specialized treatment. If your symptoms are such that you are suicidal, you must call for help. Call your local hospital, police, or at least a family member or friend and let them know where you're at. If you're not suicidal, but unsure of your current state of mind, a licensed therapist is trained to assess your level of acuity and can direct you accordingly. If your problems revolve around relationships and more common mental health challenges such as anxiety, depression, addiction, trauma, anger, mood swings, that's where the licensed therapist is on the front line. Some of you may be considering consulting with a life coach. There are many excellent life coaches out there with real talent, knowledge, and wisdom. However, buyer beware. If you consider looking at it from a practical perspective, licensed clinicians such as LMFTs or social workers had to go to graduate school. Then they were required to fulfill thousands of hours working as an intern under a supervised, seasoned professional. After the intern hour requirements were fulfilled, only then could you actually apply for the state licensing exam and pass it. So there's a lot of vetting that goes through. As a result, licensed therapists are equipped to treat higher acuity mental health cases. There are, of course, no guarantees of competency, yet a licensed clinician is usually much more capable of handling a wider variety of mental illness and higher acuity cases. Licensed therapists are also accountable to laws and ethics as defined by the licensing board within the state. In contrast, life coaches are often self-appointed, and some are certified within a matter of weeks or months. Again, I'm not trying to be demeaning. One of my most favorite and influential professional mentors is a life coach. He's Tony Robbins. He's awesome. People usually love him or hate him, but he is a collaborator, and he usually gravitates to the best in whatever field that he's focused on, whether it's health, money, finance, relationships, weight loss, you name it. So he's on the front lines. Anyway, I don't want to go down that road too much. I want you to be aware of the backgrounds behind these various mental health professionals so you can make an informed decision. When assessing the competency of a therapist, a good place to start is by learning how long they've been working in mental health and how long they've been licensed. You can do this either by asking them or looking up their license number, which is usually accompanied with their publications and advertisements. You know, age is not always synonymous with wisdom. There are many seasoned licensed therapists that lack competency. You have to be discerning. Yet it's safe to say that newly licensed therapists have a greater learning curve. Just something to keep in mind. I would say trust a therapist who positions themselves with more confidence as opposed to arrogance. There's a difference. You have to use your best instincts on that. And we'll go more into that later. So let's talk about theoretical orientations. This is where we do a deeper dive into a therapist's style and the tools they use to help you. Theoretical orientation is just a fancy way of describing this kind of position they take. Most therapists have many tools in the toolbox, combining theoretical orientations. I, for example, use different styles and techniques to reach people. I do have predominant tools I like to use, so to speak, but I want a variety of options to reach all different kinds of age demographics, culture, characteristics of people, so on. I'm describing just a few here so that you can get a better idea of what to look for when deciding upon the therapist. In grad school, we learned a certain format and categorization to these theories and styles. But I'm going to change this up a little and break it down into my own style in order for you to digest it a little bit easier. This is for the common listener. Here are 5 simplified categories I've created to compare and contrast the various styles of counseling available. They are as following: psychodynamic, cognitive, emotive, behavioral, and experiential. So let's dive into them. Let's start with psychodynamic. This is a great starting place because really that's the start and origins of psychology with regard to theoretical orientations. It has great depth. Let's break down the word psychology as it relates to psychodynamic. The etymology of the word psychology has its origins from ancient Greece. Etymology is fascinating. You can deep dive into that on its own, but basically it is the roots of our language. So often we don't really know what we're saying in our English language, so it's fascinating to look back at the origins of the words we speak. It creates greater meaning. So psycho, not to be confused with the derogatory slur describing someone as antisocial, it comes from the Greek word psyche, which means breath, spirit, soul, or mind. The suffix ology simply means the study of. So you put it all together, and the true meaning of the word psychology refers to the study of spirit, soul, or mind. I don't know about you, but I really much prefer this richer and deeper meaning to psychology. I find that far too often, especially in contemporary psychology, we focus so much on mind, and we are definitely much more as human beings than just walking cognitions. So that brings us back to the word psychodynamic. The word dynamis, origins again in Greek, translates to force or power. You put that all together and you have a word that means the power that influences breath, spirit, soul, or mind. So what could possibly be that powerful? Let's dive into what psychodynamics is about. The belief behind psychodynamic orientation is that human behaviors are motivated by unconscious parts of ourself. Insight into unconscious processes is the pathway to understanding and personal growth. As we become more self-aware, we discover that conditioning from our family and our environment has contributed to creating templates or blueprints from which we live our life. If a person strives to change their life, they must rewrite the blueprint. This is psychodynamic orientation in a nutshell. So when you think of psychodynamic theoretical orientation, relate it back to such legends as Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung. It's a deep dive and contemplative approach to therapy and tends to be long-term. Some of you may have heard of attachment theory, like what kind of attachment style do I have in my relationship? Well, the origins of attachment theory are psychodynamic. The fundamental premise is that child's earliest attachments with caregivers created a blueprint for all future relationships. It's the program. When I'm working with couples, it's valuable to look at their history from a psychodynamic perspective, because then I can get a better idea of what their template is to relating to one another when it comes to solving conflict, what love is, what marriage is, what being a parent is. There's a blueprint there. I can talk more in depth about that and potentially get sidetracked in another episode. I just want to mention it, this attachment theory, to illustrate that all of these theories, they have foundational building blocks from other theories to build upon. In fact, that's the way most of this is with theoretic orientation. Genius minds just simply build off genius minds, and the process of evolution goes on. So next, let's talk about the category I call cognitive. CBT, you've probably heard of it, of course, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a theoretic orientation with the most empirical data behind it, because the processes are very quantifiable and measurable. And for this reason, CBT is very common and standard in hospitals, all kinds of youth programs, family centers, addiction recovery centers, and other such facilities that provide mental health services. You can look at it like a bread and butter kind of standard therapeutic intervention. And the baseline is really that cognition is the key to changing your behavior and emotional processes in life. Cognition is just a fancy way of saying thought. So in essence, CBT can be reduced to the practice and process of being mindful of our thought patterns. Cognitive therapies are active, structured, and time-limited. Identification and correction of clients' disoriented negative cognitions are the central focus of the therapeutic process. The practitioner teaches the client to do the best they can to identify negative cognitions and essentially reprogram thought patterns. This process leads to more adaptive problem solving and more adaptive behavior. Interestingly enough, the roots of CBT were inspired by Zen Buddhism. So, same principles are applied. Being self-aware involves understanding your thought patterns and how these thought patterns, if you're attached to them, can either influence suffering or enlightenment. CBT is an essential tool in the box for their therapists to promote mental and emotional transformation. It should be noted that DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, is considered to have its origins in CBT. Again, these theories just build off each other. DBT is essentially a specialized form of CBT that builds upon its core principles, particularly focusing on managing intense emotions and interpersonal issues. DBT has a history of measured success treating clients with extreme emotional dysregulation, such as borderline personality disorder. That's a very difficult mental health diagnosis to work with. Neuro-linguistic programming has similarities to CBT, so I like to keep these in the same kind of category. You don't hear of NLP very much, except in certain niches. Tony Robbins uses NLP. Many inspirational people that I follow like this orientation as well. And it's very similar to CBT in that it uses many of the tools of language and patterns and thought patterns and how they relate to our current reality. Tony defines NLP as the science of programming your brain to achieve the objectives you want in life. NLP incorporates ideas from professionals in cybernetics, computer programming, with additional influences from experts in the humanistic rapport building as Virginia Satir, Milton Erickson. You can look them up. Really awesome, influential figures in psychology. Interestingly enough, NLP also has some of its sources of inspiration from hypnosis. So fascinating stuff. Basically, how do our thoughts translate to our behaviors? So moving down my list of 5, let's talk about the category I call emotive, which is the polar opposite of cognitive. In short, we can think of these modalities as less mind-centered and more feeling-centered. The way I group these emotive theories, they are humanistic theories, narrative therapies, somatic therapies. So the similarities are really that we're looking at creating holding space as therapists for the client's subjective experience. And we're very feeling oriented and centered there, in this non-judgmental, safe environment. We explore what these feelings mean, what's the perceived or actual need behind these feelings, and so on. I like to look at this as very humanistic as well. And humanistic psychology, it grew out of the opposition of behavioralism and psychoanalysis. And I see it kind of like this evolution from being so mechanical or mind or cognitive oriented to a more subjective experience, more soulful experience of emotion. The etymology of the word emotion is emovere, which is energy and motion. So I think that's a very important part. And, ironically, in grad school, there were no classes on emotion, which I think is a real flaw in traditional curriculums. Emotion is emotion's what makes us human. It's where the magic is a lot of times. We're after feelings of happiness, right? It's what distinguishes us from automatons and AI and so on, robots. The thing that's in common with these emotional focused therapies is that it focuses on the whole person, their potential and their free will as it relates to an emotional experience. A fundamental premise within these emotive theories is that authentic and honest expression of feelings leads to maturation and healthier self-esteem. Understanding and increasing emotional intelligence is often a common goal in these therapies as well. A simplified definition of emotional intelligence that I share with clients is as follows. The first is to be able to understand that emotion that's living inside you. So defining it is critical. Come up with a clear adjective. What is this emotion that's living inside of you? And then furthermore, understand the need or perceived need behind this emotion. And lastly, you have to be able to express it. You have to clearly express the emotion and the need and have it land well to the intended recipient. In emotionally focused therapies, the therapists are coaches and teachers, often down to earth as opposed to authoritative. The expression of emotions can be conversational, interactive, or even experiential. Now that opens up the whole realm of using somatic kind of therapies, dance, art, yoga. They can all help with the process of emotional expression and moving that energy. Therapy can be short-term or long-term. So moving right along, the next category is behavioral. Within this category, I've grouped action-oriented theoretical orientations, such as solution-focused, strategic, and even life coaching. What these approaches have in common is that they're less emotive or cognitive or psychodynamic, and they're more about creating behavior change. Again, I want to remind you that I'm creating my own somewhat non-conventional categories here for theoretical orientations because, behavioralism, that's a science and theory unto itself. The whole field is its own thing. Think Pavlov's dogs and ringing bells to demonstrate classical conditioning. That's behavioralism, and it's fascinating. You could go down that road. But to stay on point, the common focus of this category of behavioral change type therapies is on the here and now. Setting goals, achieving goals, and creating behavioral change is accomplished by taking action, changing power dynamics with relationships, and understanding and altering patterns of human behavior. A fundamental belief within these therapies is that the client possesses within them the inherent ability to solve their own problems. Common strategies within these therapeutic approaches are to build wellness through lifestyle change. Paying attention to nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress management, and other such holistic lifestyle choices not only improve physical health, but they also improve overall mental, emotional, and relational health. The therapist often plays an active role. They take charge, and it's a power-based relationship like a coach. Therapy is often short-term within these modalities. So moving on from behavioralism, the last category I define is experimental. This is where we can go down the rabbit hole a bit. This category includes many therapeutic techniques and technologies that have varying degrees of science behind it. Such examples are EMDR, brain spotting, or therapies that include clinical use of controlled substances such as ketamine or psilocybin therapy. So let's highlight a few of these. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, is a psychotherapeutic technique used to treat trauma and other distressing experiences. It involves focusing on traumatic memories while stimulating engaging in rhythmic eye movements, auditory stimulation, and other forms of bilateral stimulation. It's just a fancy way of saying both hemispheres of the brain are involved, and you're breaking down defense mechanisms. The main purpose is to break these defense mechanisms down so that the client can have less resistance and ultimately process the trauma. EMDR is based on the premise that certain eye positions can activate the brain's limbic system, which is involved in the emotional regulation. Brain spotting is a relatively new therapy that has been built off the foundational work of EMDR. Both are based on the idea that the brain can heal itself from trauma through a process of desensitization and reprocessing. During brain spotting, a therapist uses a pointer to guide the client's eye gaze to specific spots in the visual field. The therapist then asks the client to focus on their thoughts, feelings, and body sensations while maintaining eye contact with this pointer. This process is to help the client assess and process trauma or other emotionally stuck subjects within themselves. Let's talk about psychedelic therapies. My strongest instinct, first and foremost, is to look within as opposed to searching for answers externally with the aid of any substance or pill. However, medications absolutely have their rightful place within psychiatric treatment. On the more experimental side of psychiatric interventions is the growing use of controlled substances such as psilocybin and ketamine administered in a clinical environment. There's a growing body of evidence that psychedelic therapies treat a wide range of mental and emotional issues with great success. These drugs induce altered states of consciousness and perception, which may facilitate insight and emotional healing. According to a publication from Harvard Medical School, Harvard Health Publishing, February 2024, a prescription version of ketamine called S-ketamine or Spravato has proven to be very successful in treating chronic depression, among other things. This has been especially true treating PTSD and combat trauma within veterans of war populations. Research on psychedelic therapies is ongoing, but preliminary studies have shown promising results. For example, the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research is leading the way in exploring innovative treatments using psilocybin. At this center, researchers focus on how psychedelics affect behavior, mood, cognition, brain functioning, and the biological markers of health. There are, of course, safety considerations. These treatments best be administered under the supervision of a healthcare provider. That means medical professionals need to monitor and watch and support after the client has taken their dose. Checking vital signs and doing this in a clinical environment is optimal. It's important to note that psychedelic therapies are not a substitute for conventional mental health treatment. It is recommended that they use it in conjunction with traditional therapeutic approaches. I would really like to reach out to my community and continue to research this and do some interviews with professionals in this field. It's also important when talking about these psychedelic interventions to understand the legality. Ketamine is currently legal in California with a valid prescription. However, psilocybin is currently illegal and classified as a Schedule I controlled substances. There are processes that are working towards decriminalization within California, but it's still a work in progress. Psilocybin therapies are currently legal in the state of Colorado and Oregon. These experimental therapies, what they have in common is there's this convergence of technology and psychology. And each of these require specialized training, and many therapists go on to be certified or specialized in any one of these modalities. I want to encourage you to do your research and make an informed decision with regard to what's best for you. And also keep in mind that most therapists use a variety of these orientations together. Different tools in the toolbox. I, for example, use a predominantly humanistic theoretic orientation, solution-focused, strategic. Those are some of my most favorite ways of describing how I help clients be the best version of themselves. So wrapping this all up, if you're looking for a therapist, you have to look at their theoretic orientation, but you also have to consider how important their personality is. It's going to be up to you to be able to blend and harmonize with what they have to say. A therapist can have all the knowledge in the world and the greatest, most effective treatment strategies, or so they say, but if they position themselves in this condescending manner or arrogant or aloof, then they're going to lose their clients. That's just human nature and the ability to build human rapport with someone, which translates to safety and security. As a therapist, I work towards influencing people to look at the most vulnerable parts of themselves, the parts of themselves that are scared of, and they don't want to show the general public. There's no way a client is going to open up to me unless I've proved to them that I'm a trustworthy and safe individual. This is critical. There's an interesting concept that was illustrated within the work of a man named Chris Voss. Chris was an ex-hostage negotiator, and if you could only imagine the stories that he illustrates in his book, Never Split the Difference. He talks about these high stakes, working with terrorists and criminals, these high stakes hostage negotiation situations where it was literally life and death. Well, to my surprise, the same skills that I use as a therapist, he would use to reach these criminals or terrorists over the phone, trying to get optimal outcomes, literally life and death death outcomes. So the fascinating concept is that, human rapport building and the basic need for safety is even applicable to asocial people. So tapping into that knowledge is key. In essence, if a therapist presents themselves too forceful or in a way that is perceived as not caring, the human defense mechanism will close the door and game over. The primitive brain will prevail, fight, flight, or freeze will win. Point being, you absolutely need to trust your therapist. So wrapping up these ideas, when you meet your therapist for the first time, ask detailed questions about their training, approach to therapy, and how they handle specific situations during the initial consultation. And you have to pay attention to your gut feeling about their communication style and their overall demeanor. If you find that your therapist does not resonate with you, don't waste your time or money. It's precious. A competent therapist should be able to reach you regardless of your gender, your culture, your sexual orientation, your religion, your age, or your upbringing. Use your best instincts. Don't give the therapist too much power. They're just as human as you are. Once you've found a therapist you believe has earned your trust, that's when the journey begins. This is not for the faint of heart. Now the work of looking at yourself is right before you, just like looking into a mirror. Far too often, a client wants to place blame, shame, and guilt in the direction anywhere but themselves. Yet, we must begin with ourselves. We have to look at ourselves as the fundamental locus of control. The fundamental locus of our control is our own mind and our own ability to choose our thoughts and our words and our habits. That translates to our behavior. Change starts with us, and a competent therapist knows this. In order to have the most optimal therapeutic relationship, you want a therapist that can not only support you, but also respectfully challenge you. There's a quote that I've used for years to describe the process of therapy. I think it applies to leadership and applies to therapists. It is, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Far too often people get comfortable in their maladaptive behaviors, and they need sometimes to be gently shaken out of these patterns. So just as important as it is to support a client through grief, loss, suffering, it's just as equally important to help someone evolve. And so that sometimes takes directive approaches and creating accountability with the client to create change. One thing is for certain, change and transformation is not always comfortable, but a competent therapist will treat you with dignity and respect as they guide you through this process. Mental, emotional, and relational health is not unlike any other area in your life. It requires the application of skills and strategies, consistency, and determination fueled by compelling desire to change. Sometimes we need help, so if you do, don't be an island. Be part of humanity and reach out for guidance. This is the smartest thing you can do. I hope this episode has shed light on the process of finding the optimal therapist for you. If you found this helpful, please like it, please subscribe, and please share it with others. Stay tuned for more interesting discussions and interviews with paraprofessionals in the field of mental health. Until next time, thank you for listening to Merely Human, Mental, Emotional, and Relational Health.